Before we begin, just a quick note for those who value serious source-driven history over, surface-level summaries. If that's why you're here, subscribe to the Survival Record. This channel exists to preserve the parts of history that tend to be simplified, sanitized, or quietly forgotten. And honestly, this topic sits squarely in that category. One of the least discussed realities of the Second World War is that for millions of people, the war was not fought primarily with factory-made rifles or standardized equipment. It was fought with what could be found, stolen, repurposed, or quietly built in workshops that were never meant to produce weapons at all. Popular memory often frames the Second World War as an industrial contest decided by mass production. That is only partly true. Across occupied Europe and in besieged cities, war was also shaped by scarcity, improvisation, and the grim logic that something crude but available could matter more than something perfect but unreachable. This is the overlooked world of improvised weapons, tools built from scrap metal, agricultural parts, plumbing, and machine shop leftovers. Not because resistance fighters romanticized them, but because there was simply no alternative. These weapons existed because industrial supply lines had collapsed or were deliberately denied. In occupied territories, access to conventional arms was tightly controlled. Even possessing spare metal could invite suspicion. Resistance groups in Poland, France, Yugoslavia, and elsewhere were forced to think like engineers rather than soldiers. Scrapyards, abandoned factories, rail depots, and even household plumbing became sources of raw material. What emerges from wartime records is not recklessness, but actually careful calculation. Improvised weapons were built to be simple enough to manufacture quietly, durable enough to survive brief combat use, and disposable enough to abandon without trace. The goal was rarely to win a firefight outright. It was to create just enough force to ambush, escape, or acquire better weapons from the enemy. This mindset would later influence guerrilla warfare doctrine worldwide. Logistics matter less when ingenuity compensates for absence. The Polish resistance's homemade submachine guns reflected desperation shaped by technical discipline. Among the most studied examples are the Polish underground submachine guns, such as the WWII and earlier workshop-built designs. These were constructed in secret using steel tubing, stamped metal, and scavenged springs. While not literally made from junk alone, they relied heavily on scrap metal and repurposed industrial components. What makes these weapons significant is not their firepower, but their tolerances. Polish engineers deliberately designed them with loose mechanical tolerances so they could function despite poor machining and inconsistent materials. This ran counter to pre-war military design philosophy, which prized precision. Wartime necessity forced a reversal. Reliability under crude conditions became more valuable than elegance. That lesson would later appear in Cold War-era insurgent weapon design across multiple continents. In the Warsaw Ghetto, scrap weapons became instruments of timing rather than firepower. The weapons used during the Warsaw Ghetto uprising were often rudimentary pistols, pipe guns, and grenades made from scavenged metal containers. These devices were not intended for prolonged combat. Their purpose was to create moments, seconds of confusion, breaches in formation, or opportunities to reposition. Survivor accounts emphasize how limited ammunition and weapon durability shaped tactics. Fighters avoided sustained engagement and instead relied on surprise, elevation, and withdrawal. Improvised weapons were integrated into an overall survival strategy rather than treated as substitutes for military arms. This reveals a broader truth about survival under occupation. Resistance is often about controlling tempo, not territory. The British Sten gun blurred the line between factory weapon and scrap-built necessity. Though officially manufactured, the Sten deserves mention because its design philosophy mirrored that of underground workshops. It was intentionally simplified to the point that small factories, and in some cases resistance groups, could assemble or repair it using basic tools and scrap components. Improvised grenades across Europe were weapons of denial rather than destruction. Homemade grenades, often built from food cans, plumbing fixtures, or scrap steel cylinders, appear repeatedly in resistance archives. Their effectiveness varied widely, but their psychological impact was consistent. These devices were used to block stairwells, delay pursuit, or deny access to choke points. In urban warfare, even an unreliable explosive could alter enemy movement patterns. The intent was not mass casualties, but disruption. This tactical use of improvised explosives would later shape urban resistance movements in the latter half of the 20th century, particularly in environments where conventional arms were scarce. In Yugoslavia, rural scrap weapons reflected a different survival environment. Partisan forces in Yugoslavia operated in forests and mountainous terrain, where concealment mattered more than concealability. Improvised weapons here included single-shot firearms and crude mortars made from metal piping and agricultural scrap. These weapons were heavy, inaccurate, and dangerous to use, but they allowed partisans to engage fortified positions briefly and then disappear. The emphasis was on terrain mastery rather than technical sophistication. The Yugoslav experience demonstrated that improvised weapons must reflect geography as much as material availability, a principle now taught in survival and resistance planning. Japanese home defense weapons revealed a late-war collapse of industrial capacity. By 1945, Japan was issuing civilians and reserve forces with weapons made from low-grade steel, scrap metal, and simplified designs. These weapons were symbols of strategic exhaustion. Their presence underscored how material shortages can force nations to abandon long-standing military standards almost overnight. The lesson is stark. Industrial strength is not permanent, and preparedness cannot assume uninterrupted production. Improvised anti-vehicle weapons relied more on placement than penetration. Molotov cocktails made from scavenged bottles and flammable liquids are among the most widely known improvised weapons of the Second World War. What is less discussed is how their effectiveness depended almost entirely on tactical placement rather than raw destructive power. Resistance manuals emphasized attacking vision ports, engine compartments, and ventilation rather than armor. This focus on system vulnerability rather than brute force influenced later asymmetric warfare doctrine. Understanding systems, not just weapons, became a core survival principle. The greatest risk of scrap-built weapons was often to the user, not the enemy. Accidental detonations, barrel failures, and misfires were common. Builders accepted these risks because the alternative was inaction. Wartime correspondence shows a sober awareness of these dangers, not bravado. This reality strips away romanticism. Improvised weapons were tools of necessity, built by people fully aware of their limitations and costs. That honesty is part of what makes these stories worth preserving. What these weapons ultimately reveal is not ingenuity alone, but constraint-driven decision-making. Scrap-built weapons did not win the war. They allowed people to participate in it under conditions designed to erase their agency. They shaped resistance culture, influenced post-war military thinking, and left a legacy that continues to inform survival strategy today. Remembering these weapons means remembering the environments that produce them: scarcity, occupation, isolation, and determination, shaped by reality rather than ideology. If you value careful historical analysis and the lessons hidden beneath familiar narratives, subscribe to the Survival Record and share this video with others who want more than simplified history. Understanding how people adapted when stripped of resources helps us understand the true mechanics of survival, then and now.